Hi, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. Virginia has a rich literary history, from Edgar Allan Poe and Ellen Glasgow to Patricia Cornwell and David Baldacci. Virginians have been scribbling away decade after decade. In the Virginia Room at the Virginia Library in Richmond, there are 9,000 books by Virginia writers. And every year, the Virginia Library hosts a ceremony honoring Virginia writers, an award ceremony. So if you've ever thought that you might like to be part of Virginia's rich history of literary accomplishments, this may be the show for you, because our guest today is here to tell you how to get started. And our guest is Mr. Steve Altman, author, blogger, teacher. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you so much, Chuck.
So, can you give us a little insight into your background and how and why you got started in writing?
Sure. It was interesting to hear you say that Virginians have been scribbling away decade after decade, because that's what I've been doing. I've been scribbling away since I was about 17, which is about 45 years ago. I have some things to show for it, some things in print, some things not, many things not. But the most important thing I've gotten out of it are the things that writing gives you simply by writing, simply by being involved in the writing life. And that reaches from the friends that you make and the thoughts that you have in your head to the satisfaction that you get out of simply reaching inside of yourself and finding things there that you didn't know were there in the first place. So for, 35 years I worked for the federal government. I made my living writing. I wrote speeches, I wrote reports, I wrote testimonies, I wrote just everything anybody needed. In fact, I was known as the writer of last resort in the last agency I was in. But all that time, when I wasn't working to pay the mortgage, I was working on my own fiction. And I always wanted to teach fiction. I left graduate school on my way to a doctorate, in part because the academic approach to reading and writing and criticism were just not a good fit for me. I'm not academic. I love reading and I love writing, and I'm not much for the academic underpinnings of that. So right now I teach short story writing to adults, and when I teach it, I take a particularly unacademic approach, I think. It's not based so much on publishing, it's based on the personal satisfactions of creating things from within yourself.
So, if I thought I had some talent, but wasn't sure, and I had an itch to write, how would I get started? What should I do?
Well, it's a cheap sport to get into. It's a cheap art form. You don't have to hire a film crew. You don't have to get a big block of marble. You don't have to buy a bike. All you have to do is get to your computer monitor and start keying stuff in. That's really the hardest part for anybody, because it's much easier to think about writing. God knows I do. It's much easier to think about writing than to actually write. To actually get involved in writing and continue writing requires, I think, a step one. And I talk to my students about this. You've been there, so you know. You have to figure out why you're writing. If you're writing because you think you're going to become famous and make a living at it, that's probably no more reasonable than to pick up the guitar because you want to become a rock and roll star. The odds against it are pretty high. But if you decided that you wanted to write because you have stuff in you that has to get out, that you have emotions you want to plumb or experiences that need to be written down, perhaps for your grandchildren, or perhaps for your spouse, or perhaps just so you'll better understand yourself, you just get started and you do it. Write about the thing that you really care about, not necessarily the thing you know about the most. You can do research to fill in the blanks, but the thing you care about the most. If you start with the story that you really want to write, don't wait for that story till you get better at writing. Do it now. If you start with a story you really want to write, chances are you'll stick to it. The main thing that happens to writers is that they give up. Young writers or beginning writers give up because what's on the page or the screen doesn't necessarily match what was in their head, doesn't match the excitement, the spark that came to them when they thought of the idea. The thing to do is get started, stay with it, and keep going.
So they get bored with the idea, and that's why they stop writing.
It fizzles. I have a rule in my short story class, which is no serial killers. You can't write about serial killers. Why? Because very few of us probably grew up dreaming about becoming writers because we really had a serial killer story we wanted to tell. We had other stories reflecting our own life experiences that really drove us to want to do this thing. Stick to those things, at least for now.
Well, you know, there are a lot of very imaginative stories, and you wonder where they come from. The Hunger Games, for example, very popular now. Obviously, this couldn't have come out of this woman's life, but it's quite a tale. So where do people get their ideas?
There's a really good chance that Edgar Allan Poe never dug up corpses and pulled out their teeth either. But somewhere in there was the spark of perversity, or the spark of what thrills me and doesn't thrill most people, or what is it that would really haunt me, what would scare me. It comes from out of the person.
And then you just kind of, I think one of the exercises you had in your class was a series of what if, and you just keep following the what if question.
Sure. I think the best place to get ideas is out of your own life. Now, I list 3 in class. I say, find your ideas out of your own experience, find your ideas out of the experiences of people you've talked to, or steal. Steal from, Shakespeare stole like crazy. Of course, it's a commonplace that he did. But even now, you can steal from Shakespeare. People will know it's from Shakespeare, and they'll say, well, that's a homage, you know. But the thing to do is to use the material that you begin with simply as material, as raw material from which you begin and from which you proceed. If I started writing about, say, my childhood, there's no reason in the world that I had to have one brother in the story, even though I had one brother in real life. Perhaps it was my father who gave me a hard time one day, and that started me on the story. It could be that for purposes of the story, he becomes my mom. Or perhaps he isn't my father at all. Perhaps my father ran off with the lady who worked in the cigar store. You don't know. But the first thing to do is find what drives you. Use it as raw material. Fiction is not a memoir. You are not accountable for the facts. You are accountable for the truth.
Now, a lot of people get bogged down in their writing or become afraid of their writing because they don't want to reveal too much of themselves. And of course, you know, a lot of writers through history, Hemingway and whatnot, had deep personal problems that got reflected in drinking and substance abuse. So is that a valid concern, that people are going to reveal too much of themselves, or what do you think of that?
Well, it depends on who you are. Now, one of the most famous modern stories of this kind of thing happening was Truman Capote, who invented something called the nonfiction novel when he wrote In Cold Blood, which was as close as he could get to an account of what actually happened when a couple of murderers stormed into a random farmhouse in Kansas and wiped out the family. He wrote an account of that was so full and dramatic it read like a novel. He took that approach back to New York, where he knew all the society ladies, and he decided that he would write about them without their knowing. He would write about them in much the same way. Well, he did, and they all abandoned him. They hated him, they felt betrayed, and they should have. Well, on a smaller scale, all of us have people that we know, or a small number of people that we know, who we would be betraying if we were to accurately reflect what went on in the fiction. The question is, do you feel that you are responsible to your art in some special way that allows you to hurt other people or to be indiscreet? Or whether you can so alter the facts so that it doesn't have to hurt anyone. I know many married writers who have a lot of things to write that they can't write because they're married, or involved in situations where, say, working for a federal agency, it would no longer behoove them in the federal agency to write about those experiences. Once again, you don't have to write what actually happened. If you do write what actually happened, have it happen to someone other than you.
Well, they always said that F. Scott Fitzgerald would just follow his wife Zelda around with a pad, and 3 months later their married life would show up in a novel.
Yeah, I think if I led their life, that would have been a real temptation too.
So what would you say the key elements are to creating a story?
Well, if we're talking about a short story, which is a different breed of cat than a novel, but then again, I don't teach novels, I teach short stories. If we're talking about a short story, what you want is to arrive at is a moment of revelation of some kind. This is the classic New Yorker model for a short story, but actually it's more broad than that. The folks who used to make a living writing short stories, when you could make a living writing short stories, guys like Fitzgerald and like Hemingway, there were magazines then that you could write for, and the magazines could actually sell based on the fact that they contained short stories written by good writers. But what they all had in their story was an unresolved situation. Some protagonist who you wanted to find out about, or who you were rooting for, facing an unresolved situation that demanded resolution or revelation, a secret that needed revealing, a mystery that needed solving, a romantic situation that had to be fixed, a conflict that had to be resolved one way or the other. Who will survive the bullfight, or who will have the courage to face the bull? Will he have the courage, or won't he have the courage? Will the girl abandon the guy? All of this stuff. So people want a story, and they want someone who they care about to face odds or to face an unresolved situation. In the story, the situation doesn't have to be resolved. What you need to see is what happens to the character or characters as they try to resolve it. So in the first 2 pages of a short story, and of course you've heard this before, I need a protagonist I care about, and I need to know what that protagonist wants or is up against, so that I'll read the rest of the story to find out. If I don't care about the protagonist, or if nothing seems to need resolving, there's no reason for me not to go watch TV or play with the dog.
So a lot of people think, I've got a novel in me. You know, they've said everybody's got a novel in them, it's their life. But should they start with a smaller form, like a short story, and perfect their craft?
There's a great New Yorker cartoon I just have to bring up where the patient, typical guy in his underwear, is sitting on the examination table, and the doctor comes in with the results, and he says, "I'm afraid you have a novel in you that has to come out." I just love that. Maybe you have a short story and no more in you that has to come out. I would say start with the short story, because you'll find out in no time whether you can parse a sentence, whether people can see that there's a real human on the page, or some chess piece that you've created. It's a long walk from being able to write a short story to being able to write a novel. I know this very well personally. But I will say this, that if you go to college and get into either an undergraduate creative writing class or into a graduate level, an MFA program, they will teach you beginning with short stories. In fact, almost exclusively with short stories. Part of that has to do with the fact that short stories allow people to take them home and read them and come back and critique them for the folks who wrote them. It's easier to do that than with a novel. But also, you can work on the basic elements of storytelling. You can work on the basic elements of the craft itself, characterization, setting, voice, and so on, at the short story level. On the other hand, if you're so inclined to write and you want to write a novel, go for it. There's nobody investing in you. There's nobody waiting for your short story or your novel. There's no reason why you shouldn't do the thing that excites you.
Writer's block. Even the most accomplished writer sometimes just sits at the blank page and nothing comes out.
I have no experience in that. I just don't know anything about writer's block. I'm really sorry. Actually, I've lived with writer's block my whole life. The best approach I have found to writer's block is to be accountable to someone other than yourself. In other words, have a deadline. Now, I do a blog. I do a blog called 317am.net, which is all about writing, or mostly about writing. The reason I've been able to write those blog posts twice a week for 2.5 years is because I have a partner, and he has to do the same thing. And if he weren't accountable to me, and I weren't accountable to him for our deadlines, there's a good chance there would be no blog. He and I have also, having been friends for 40 years, he and I also occasionally engage in something called the Short Story Challenge. That's what we call it. We'll be sitting in Starbucks, and it'll be May 8th, and we'll say, July 16th, we're going to meet right back here, and we're going to hand each other a short story. And there's no way out. You can't keep your pride if you don't show up. That's the best way around writer's block, a deadline. Now, another way around writer's block is, I've got two more. Another way around writer's block is to think of something more important than your writing and avoid it by writing. This habit, I use this all the time. You know, if you're supposed to be doing your taxes, it's easy to write your short story. So use that approach. And let's see, there was a third one there. Oh yes, the third one involves goal setting. Everyone will tell you to set goals. I think goals are overrated when it comes to story writing. I think the time that you put in is much more important. If you put the time in every day, say after you get home from work, from 5 till 6:30, you're going to sit at that keyboard and write. If you put that time in, those stories will get written. If not, a whole lot of material that can then be edited into a story will be written. So even if you don't have the goal in mind or the deadline in mind, put the time in.
Now what about dictation? I mean, does it make, some people say, well, I can't get it on paper, but I can say it. Would you recommend that? Is that?
Unless you're John Milton, who dictated Paradise Lost to his daughters, I wouldn't recommend it. I think Mark Twain, who was not blind like Milton was, but Twain was getting old and crotchety, I think he dictated most of the recently published autobiographical materials to a daughter. But no, I wouldn't recommend it. I think there's a lot to be said for the strange process of the brain coagulating some signals that it sends down through your arms and out your fingertips and onto a keyboard, and then you see it up on the screen and you read it and it comes back into your eyes and it gets processed again. Just walking around the lake and thinking about your story is no way to conceive of a story. But sitting at the keyboard and typing away and saying, hey, Chuck, what are you up to? Well, I've got this story about this white whale. Well, that's ridiculous. What do you mean? Well, this guy wants the whale. That will get you closer more quickly and in more concrete terms to what you're looking for.
Okay. How does what you're saying relate to a visual medium like screenplays? Now, I think you are writing or have written some screenplays?
Yeah, unless you're Terrence Malick and you can write movies where nothing happens for hours, you need a story. And the rules of story writing are very similar in movies and television. They're very similar to what we're talking about in fiction. There are specific stages of a script at which you have to reach milestone 1 and milestone 2 and so on. They have rules for these things, and if you take a screenwriting course, they'll teach them to you. You'll find out what has to happen on page 20. But essentially, it's the same deal. It's a 3-act structure is what they call it. You know, something has to be set underway, and then people have to try and work it out, and then it has to get resolved. And in screenplays, they'll always tell you that just before it gets resolved, everything has to go really, really dark, so that the darkest hour is just before the dawn. All that sort of thing. The rules essentially, though, are the same.
Okay. So I've written my short story or my novel. Any tips on getting it published?
Would you like to make the U.S. Olympic swim team? You know, the odds of getting published in the sense of, gee, I think I'll write Hunger Games and make $1 million. Go ahead and try. But it seems to me, at least, that the reason we get into writing, as opposed to going and getting a law degree or a degree in business and figuring out how to do derivatives, is because we have some creative impulse. That creative impulse is going to be there no matter what. I say work on that first and then worry about being published later. But if you're interested in getting published in New York, which is the heart of publishing, you don't have to go to New York, unlike movies where you have to go to LA. You don't have to go to New York, but it does help to know people who are in the publishing business or connected to it in some way. So move in circles of people who are involved in publishing, who want to get published, who know people who publish, and so on. That's the best way to do it, because your alternative is to send things into agents in a time-honored fashion called over the transom. And that means something where no one is expecting your submission, and it arrives and it's opened by a clerk who lets it kind of ferment for a while in a corner before sending it back with a rejection letter. That's not what you want to do, even if you've written Hunger Games and think it would sell 1 million copies. So networking is incredibly important when it comes to publishing in New York. If you're interested in publishing in the literary journals, which means you're in college and you're in a writer's workshop, you're in an MFA program, and you want to get published, that's a different ballgame. And it's a different kind of networking that goes on. It goes on in an academic setting and in a literary journal setting, and those literary journals are all connected to universities, or almost all are. So that's a different kind of networking, but you have a better chance there. You have a paltry chance, though, of making any money off of that. It is a commonplace for literary quarterlies to pay in copies of the quarterly, so that you get published and you are rewarded with half a dozen copies of your story. I think the thing to do is not to think so much about getting published when you're starting as to figuring out what kind of writer you are and how good you are at getting your stories done. The measure of success, I say this all the time to myself as well as to my students, the measure of success at our level is, will people who aren't your wife or husband or significant other finish what you've written if you hand it to them? Would they finish it even if they didn't have to? Think about the person who picks up your story if you inadvertently leave it behind on the metro. If you leave it on the seat beside you and get off the train and somebody picks it up and it has the title such and such, would they read it? Would they read past the first page? Would they stick it in their briefcase and go home with it? That's a good measure. That's what we should be shooting for.
What about some of the new publishing options, like ebooks and of course blogs? I mean, it can get to people all over the world.
I think it's wonderful. It's marvelous. It couldn't be better. For one thing, just to get back to that previous question, if you are hoping to be published by a real live commercial publisher who is hoping to make money off of your work and pass some of it along to you, there is visibility to be had if you publish an ebook now through, say, Amazon Kindle or something like that. There is visibility to be gained, and they keep track of these things, so that if you did happen to catch fire and sell 20 or 30,000 copies of your story, somebody might be out there to pick it up. But better than that, even if it isn't a success in commercial terms, at least you're getting it before readers. That is a marvelously, marvelously satisfying experience. Our blog doesn't draw that many viewers, but among those people who tune in, some read, enjoy, and let us know. And of course, that's why we're involved in it in the first place. If you want to make a living, go get a job. Don't try to write. But if you want the satisfactions of creating things out of yourself and somehow or another reaching out to people who you wouldn't otherwise be able to reach, then you want to write.
So if people are interested in your classes, learning more about how you teach and what you teach, how would they go about contacting you?
Well, you can reach me at my, you can email me anytime. You can look on 317am.net and look under About the Author. It will tell you what my email address is. You can also check the Fairfax County Adult and Community Ed catalog when it comes out and look for a course called Writing a Short Story. We're done for the summer, but we're going to be back in business in the fall.
Great. Well, as we wind down, what is the one thing that you'd like folks to come away with, the most important thing if they want to launch on a literary career, or if they already have and are kind of bogged down?
I would say this. Unlike a lot of other things that you do as a creative pastime, say gardening or learning to play an instrument, people seem to feel that when they start writing, automatically they ought to be writing as well as the things that interested them in writing in the first place, the things they've read and really like. You're not going to be able to write like that. Don't hold yourself to an impossible standard, not as a beginner. If you just picked up the guitar, you're not going to start playing songs. You're going to start with chords. And you're certainly not going to get hired for a gig at the Birchmere. So take your time, be patient with yourself, see how much satisfaction you get from what you are doing, and then work your way up from there.
Well, thanks a lot, Steve. I've learned a lot, and I hope you have too. Thank you for joining us on Virginia Time Travel. This has been brought to you by a generous gift from the Margarita W. and Donald J. Metzger Endowment. We hope you'll visit us at our website, www.timetravel21.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.